Margaret Harrison never imagined that the smiling neighbor next door was hiding something so disturbing. His 8-year-old daughter Emma, who loved to play in the sunny backyard of her Portland-Orty home, began to absolutely refuse to leave the house whenever she saw Mr. Wallace at the window. The girl trembled, her eyes were wide with fear, and she grasped her mother's hand with desperate force. Margaret felt a chill down her spine as Emma whispered with a choked voice and her lips quivering, "Mother, he always watches me." When Margaret finally decided to investigate the neighbor's house, what she discovered would change everything forever. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back a few weeks to the days when everything seemed normal and safe. Margaret Harrison was 42 years old and working as a nurse at Portland Central Hospital, a job she loved but left her exhausted. She was a strong woman with brown hair always tied in a practical ponytail, with attentive green eyes that never missed a detail. Since their divorce 3 years ago, Margaret had been raising Emma alone, working night shifts on weekends to make sure her daughter had everything she needed. The two lived in a cozy 2-story house, painted white with blue accents, in a quiet American suburban neighborhood called Laurelhurst. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes down the street without fear, where neighbors greeted each other with genuine smiles, and where homes had spacious backyards with white picket fences and manicured gardens. Emma was the ray of sunshine in Margaret's life. The 8-year-old girl had long blonde hair that her mother tied in braids every morning before school, bright blue eyes full of curiosity, and a smile that lit up any room. Emma was a cheerful, communicative, and energetic child. She loved playing outside, making sandcastles in the backyard, watching butterflies perch on flowers in the garden, and spending hours in the pink playhouse Margaret had set up for her the year before. The girl attended Laurelhurst Elementary School, where she was known for her confident and friendly personality. The teachers always commented in the meetings that Emma was participative, creative, and had a natural facility for making friends. Mother and daughter had a deeply close relationship. Every night before going to sleep, they sat together in Emma's bed and talked about the day. Margaret always made a point of asking how school had been, if anything had bothered her daughter, if she was happy. Emma always responded with lively stories about classes, friends, the drawings she had made in art class. The neighbor next door was Richard Wallace, a 56-year-old retired man who had lived alone since his wife had passed away 5 years ago. He was a man of ordinary and quiet appearance, with grey hair always carefully combed, thin-framed glasses, and a polite and smiling manner. Mr. Wallace always wore polo shirts in muted colours, well-pressed khakis, and comfortable shoes. He took care of the garden of the house with dedication, watering the plants every morning and afternoon, mowing the lawn on weekends. He was always friendly when he met the neighbours, greeted them with a cordial wave, sometimes commented on the weather or complimented the flowers in someone's garden. He seemed to be just a lonely and harmless gentleman, a retiree who spent his days taking care of the house and occupying himself with small daily tasks. But something was about to reveal a truth that no one in the neighborhood could have imagined. In this video, you'll discover how one mother trusted her maternal instinct even when everyone said she was overreacting. You'll see how small signs, which most people would completely ignore, have become the key to saving your daughter from something terrible. You will also discover how courage and determination can change everything in a matter of hours, and how we should never ignore when a child shows fear. Every detail here is based on true events, and this story needs to be known by every mother who wants to protect her children. It all started on an ordinary summer day, a sunny Saturday in late August, when Margaret arrived home after a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital. It was a warm, muggy afternoon, with the sun still high in the cloudless blue sky, and she expected to find Emma playing in the yard as she always did on Saturdays. The backyard of the Harrisons' house was Margaret's pride. She had installed a blue swing the year before, attached to a sturdy wooden frame that she assembled herself with the help of a friend. There was also the pink playhouse, with real windows and a little door that opened and closed, where Emma spent hours creating imaginary stories, pretending that she was a teacher or a doctor or a famous cook. The backyard floor was covered with soft green grass, and there were beds with colourful flowers on the borders, white daisies, red roses, and yellow tulips that Margaret planted every year in the spring. But that Saturday, when Margaret parked her car in the garage and walked in through the kitchen door, dropped her heavy bag on the counter and called for her daughter, there was no response from the backyard. Emma was sitting in the living room, cuddling with her weather-worn brown teddy bear, the one she'd carried since she was 3 years old. The girl was facing the window that overlooked the street, but she wasn't looking out with that typical childlike curiosity. His face had a tense expression, his brows furrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. She held the teddy bear so tightly that her little fingers turned white at the knuckles. "Emma, my love, why aren't you outside?" Margaret asked as she put away her bag and took off the uncomfortable shoes she wore while on duty. "It's a beautiful day, perfect for playing on the swing." Emma turned her head slowly and looked at her mother. Her blue eyes were large and filled with something Margaret couldn't fully identify at that moment. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was just tiredness. "I don't want Mommy," the girl replied in a low and hesitant voice. "I prefer to stay here today." Margaret thought it was strange, but did not insist. Emma sometimes had days when she preferred quieter activities, watching cartoons or drawing with colored pencils scattered around the living room table. She thought that maybe her daughter was just tired or in the mood to do something different. The life of a child had ups and downs, days of great energy and quieter days. "All right, dear," Margaret said, smiling. "I'm going to take a quick shower, and then we can make popcorn and watch a movie together. How about it?" Emma nodded but didn't smile back. She just looked out the window again, hugging the teddy bear. Margaret went upstairs to the bedroom, took a hot shower that relaxed her sore muscles, put on comfortable clothes, and returned to the living room. Emma was still in the same position, as if she hadn't moved an inch. Margaret sat next to her daughter on the beige sofa and stroked her blonde hair. "It's okay, my love," he asked softly. "You seem quiet today." "I'm fine, Mommy," Emma replied quickly, but her voice sounded automatic without the usual excitement. "I just don't want to leave today." "All right." Margaret didn't force anything else. Maybe it was just a passing phase, he thought. Children had moods that changed from one day to the next. But the next day, Sunday, the scene was repeated. It was another beautiful summer day, with blue skies and a gentle breeze that swayed the flowers in the garden. Margaret woke up early, made pancakes for breakfast, the ones Emma loved with strawberry syrup and whipped cream. The girl ate in silence, answering her mother's questions with monosyllables. After breakfast, Margaret suggested that Emma go play outside while she washed the dishes. "I don't want Mommy," Emma said immediately, her eyes fixed on the empty plate. "I can stay in my room drawing." Margaret frowned. Emma had always loved being outdoors. She was one of those children who had to be called several times to come into the house at dinner time because she was so entertained playing that she didn't want to stop. Seeing the girl refusing the backyard 2 days in a row was unusual. "But you love playing outside, dear," Margaret insisted gently. "The swing is waiting for you, and look what a beautiful day. We can even have a picnic under the tree." "I don't want Mommy," Emma repeated, this time in a firmer, almost desperate tone. "Please, can I just stay in here?" Margaret looked at her daughter intently. There was something in Emma's eyes, a glint of anxiety that wasn't normal. "All right, my love," Margaret relented. "You can stay in your room, but if you want to talk about something, anything, I'm here, okay?" Emma nodded and ran out to the upstairs bedroom. Margaret stayed in the kitchen, washing the dishes slowly, lost in thought. Something was different with Emma. But what? The girl did not look sick. He had no fever, no cough, no complaining of pain anywhere. So why this strange behavior? The next day, Monday, Emma went to school as normal. Margaret drove her by car, as she did every morning before going to the hospital. The girl was quiet in the back seat, looking out the window. "Are you okay to go to school today?" Margaret asked, looking in the rearview mirror. "If you're not feeling well, we can stay home." "I'm fine, Mommy," Emma replied. "I'm just tired." Margaret left her daughter in front of the school, saw Emma walk through the main door with her backpack on her back, and went to work with a twinge of worry in her chest that she tried to ignore. During the day, he called the school twice, which he usually did not do, to ask if Emma was okay. The secretary said yes, the girl was participating in classes normally, without any apparent problem. When Margaret picked up Emma in the late afternoon, she asked how the day had been. "It was good, Mommy," Emma replied half-heartedly. "We had a science class and I liked it." At home, Emma went straight to her bedroom. Margaret prepared dinner, pasta with tomato sauce, one of her daughter's favorite dishes. He called Emma to eat and they dined together in silence. Margaret tried to strike up a conversation. "And what you learned in science class today?" "About butterflies," Emma replied. The teacher showed photos of various types. "How cool! You know there are butterflies in our backyard, don't you? We could go out there tomorrow after school and try to find some real ones. Write down how many we see. What do you think?" Emma's reaction was immediate and frightening. The girl dropped her fork on the plate with a loud metallic noise. Her eyes widened and she began to shake her head frantically. "No, Mom, I don't want to," she said in a trembling voice. "I don't want to go outside." "Please don't make me go." Margaret was paralyzed, her heart tightening in her chest. "Calm down, my love, calm down," she said quickly, reaching out to take her daughter's hand. "You don't have to go outside if you don't want to. It's okay. We stay inside." Emma breathed fast, her chest rising and falling, her eyes filled with tears that threatened to fall. "Mommy promises. He promises he won't make me leave. I promise, dear," Margaret said, her voice brimming with concern. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. But Emma, can you tell me what's scaring you? Something happened outside. Someone hurt you. Some animal scared you." Emma shook her head but said no more. He just got up from the table and ran to the bedroom, leaving dinner halfway. Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, her stomach turned, her hands shaking slightly. There was something very wrong going on. Emma was not one to have irrational fears. She was always a brave child who explored the world without hesitation. Seeing her daughter so afraid to go out in her own backyard was completely out of the ordinary. If you've made it this far, it's because real history interests you. Help this content reach more people, leave the like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. On Tuesday of that same week, Margaret was off duty from the hospital. He decided to stay at home to watch Emma more closely, to try to understand what was happening. The girl went to school in the morning, and Margaret spent the morning cleaning the house. But her mind was far from household chores. She couldn't stop thinking about Emma's strange behavior, the absolute refusal to go out in the yard, the panic in the girl's eyes when she suggested they go outside together. At lunchtime, Margaret was in the kitchen preparing cheese and ham sandwiches when she looked out the window that looked out the backyard. From there, she could see not only her own yard, but also part of the yard of the house next door, Mr. Wallace's house. The man was there, as always, tending the garden. He wore a light green polo shirt and beige pants and was watering the plants with a hose, slow, methodical movements. It seemed like the most normal scene in the world. A retired gentleman tending to the garden on a quiet summer afternoon. Mr. Wallace looked in the direction of Margaret's house, and when he realized she was at the window, he nodded politely, with a gentle smile on his face. Margaret returned the greeting automatically, raising her hand in a brief wave. He seemed like an ordinary, pleasant neighbor. There was nothing threatening about him, nothing to justify fear. But when Margaret turned to call Emma to help her set the table for lunch, she froze in place. Emma was huddled behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. The girl was on her side, pressed against the wall, peering out the side window with wide eyes. His body was tense, his shoulders hunched, like a small animal hiding from a predator. She watched her neighbor's yard with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "Emma?" Margaret called softly, walking slowly towards her daughter. "What are you doing there, darling?" Emma jumped up startled, as if she had been caught doing something forbidden. His face turned red, his eyes even wider. "Nothing, Mommy," she said quickly, her voice high-pitched. "I was just looking. I was just seeing if there were birds outside." But his eyes betrayed nervousness. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Margaret crouched in front of her daughter, placing her hands on Emma's small shoulders. "My love, can you tell me the truth? What you were looking out the window? You were looking at Mr. Wallace's yard." Emma bit her lower lip hard, so much so that Margaret feared she was going to hurt herself. The girl looked down, fixing her eyes on the wooden floor of the room. "He was outside," Emma whispered so quietly that Margaret hardly heard it. "He's always out there." "And is there a problem with that?" Margaret asked gently, trying to understand. "Mr. Wallace lives there. It is normal for him to be in his backyard taking care of the plants. But he looks over here, Mommy," Emma said. And now his voice was charged with genuine fear. "He always looks here, always looks at me when I'm out there. I feel like Mom. I feel his eyes following me." Margaret felt her heart tighten even more. She looked out the window again. Mr. Wallace was still watering the plants, back to back now, seemingly completely oblivious to anything but his garden. He wasn't looking at the Harrisons' house. He wasn't looking anywhere but the flowers in front of him. "Emma, dear," Margaret said in the calmest voice she could, "Mr. Wallace is only tending his garden. He's not looking here." "Maybe you did." "I didn't imagine it," Emma said firmly, raising her eyes to meet her mother's. There were tears on the edges of her blue eyes. "He does look, Mom, when you're not here, when I'm alone playing. He stays in his window, that window on the second floor that overlooks our backyard, and he stands there looking at me. Sometimes he waves, as if he were calling me." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine. She looked next door, at the second-story window that Emma had mentioned. It was an ordinary window, with white curtains partially closed. There was no one there now. The window was empty and silent. "Are you sure of that, Emma?" Margaret asked, holding her daughter's small hands. "You're sure you saw Mr. Wallace at the window looking at you?" "I'm sure, Mommy," Emma said, and a tear ran down her cheek. "He does it every time. Every time I go out to play. In a few minutes he appears in the window, and it stays there, just looking. He doesn't do anything, he just watches. It scares me a lot, Mom." Margaret pulled her daughter into a tight embrace. He could feel Emma trembling against his chest. "All right, my love, all right," Margaret murmured, stroking the girl's hair. "You don't have to play outside. You stay inside where you are safe, you are fine. And Mom will find out what's going on, I promise." Emma pulled away from the embrace and looked at her mother with red eyes. "Do you believe me, Mommy?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Can you believe he looks at me?" "I believe in you, dear," Margaret said, "and I meant that for real." But deep down, a part of her still doubted. It would be Emma really telling the truth, or it was a child's imagination, perhaps some nightmare she had that she was now mistaking for reality. Emma had never lied before. She has always been an honest, direct girl, unable to invent stories to get attention. So why was Margaret doubting now? Because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The alternative meant that the neighbor, a man who had lived there for years, a man who had always been polite and cordial, was doing something very, very wrong. And if that were true, Margaret would have failed to protect her daughter. It would have left Emma vulnerable to something dangerous right under her nose. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon watching. After Emma had calmed down and gone into the bedroom to draw, Margaret was positioned in the living room, standing by the window, hidden behind the curtains so as not to be seen from outside. He watched the house next door for almost 2 hours. He saw Mr. Wallace finish watering the garden. She saw him enter the house. She saw him walk out the front door to fetch mail from the box on the street. She saw him go back inside. But he didn't see anything suspicious. She didn't see him in the second-floor window. She didn't see him looking at the Harrisons' house. Nothing. Maybe Emma really did. Or maybe he only did it when Emma was alone in the backyard. Margaret didn't know what to think. My head hurt from processing contradictory information so much. On one side, the word of her daughter, a child who never lied. On the other hand, the apparent normality of everything, the lack of any concrete evidence of wrong behavior. Margaret tried to talk to Emma that evening after dinner. They were sitting on the sofa in the living room, the curtains closed now that it was getting dark outside. Emma hugged the teddy bear tightly, as if it were a protective shield. "Daughter," Margaret started carefully, "you look different this week. Something happened at school. Someone bothered you. Some child was rude to you." Emma shook her head in the negative, but didn't look her mother in the eye. "No, Mom. Everything is fine at school." "So why don't you want to play in the yard anymore?" Margaret asked gently. "You've always loved being out there. I loved the swing. I loved the playhouse. What changed my love?" Emma bit her lower lip again. Her fingers squeezed the teddy bear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I just don't want Mommy anymore," she said in a low voice. "I don't feel safe there. I can stay inside." "Of course you can, honey," Margaret said, pulling her daughter closer. "You can stay wherever you want. But I need to know if something scared you. If someone has done something that made you uncomfortable, you can tell me anything, Emma. Anything, really. I will always believe in you, and I will always protect you." Emma was silent for a long moment. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock and the light breathing of both. Then Emma spoke, so low that it was almost a whisper. "It is Mr. Wallace, Mom." "Mr. Wallace," Margaret repeated, her heart racing. "What is he, dear?" "He scares me," Emma said, and her voice trembled. "The way he looks at me, the way he always appears in the window when I'm alone. Once he put a poster in the window." Margaret felt the blood run cold in her veins. "A poster," she repeated, her voice coming out higher than usual. "What kind of poster, Emma?" "It had my name, Mommy," Emma said, and now the tears began to fall freely down my face. He had written Emma in big red letters, as if he were calling me, as if he wanted me to go there. "I was very scared, Mom, very scared indeed." Margaret hugged her daughter with all her strength, feeling Emma sob against her chest. Her own heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. His hands trembled as he stroked his daughter's hair. "It's okay, my love. It's okay," Margaret repeated like a mantra. "Mom's here. Mom will find out what's going on. You're safe. I promise you're safe." But was Emma really safe? Margaret looked out the window at the house next door, now dark with only a few interior lights on. The window on the second floor had the curtains closed. There was no poster. There was nothing. Was Emma telling the truth? Or was it an imaginary child's fear, perhaps fueled by some nightmare or some scary story he heard at school? Margaret couldn't sleep that night. She lay on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, tossing and turning between the sheets. The mind did not stop working. He relived all the interactions he had had with Mr. Wallace in the last few months. He was always polite, always cordial. He always kept a respectful distance. I never said anything inappropriate. He never did anything that seemed wrong. So why was Emma so afraid of him? At 3 o'clock in the morning, Margaret got up and went to Emma's room. He opened the door slowly and peeked inside. Emma was asleep, wrapped in the sheets with the teddy bear hugging her chest, her face serene in the darkness. Margaret stood there for several minutes just watching her daughter breathe, feeling a mixture of overwhelming love and paralyzing fear. If something was really going on, if someone was really threatening Emma, Margaret would do anything to protect her. Anything, really. During the next few days, Margaret began to discreetly observe Mr. Wallace's behavior. Every time I left for work, I looked back before getting into the car, checking to see if he was around, watching what he was doing. Every time I got home, even before getting out of the car, I looked next door, at the windows, looking for anything out of the ordinary. But I never saw anything suspicious. Mr. Wallace remained the usual polite neighbor. He greeted her with a smile when he saw her. Sometimes he commented on the weather, on how hot it was for August, on how beautiful his roses were blooming this year. Completely normal and trivial conversations. Once, on Thursday morning, when Margaret was leaving to take Emma to school, Mr. Wallace was taking out the rubbish to the pavement. "Good morning, Margaret," he said with that gentle smile. "How is little Emma? I haven't seen her playing in the backyard lately." "She's fine." Margaret felt a knot in her stomach when she heard him mention Emma. "She's okay, thank you," Margaret replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Only busy with activities at home." "I'm glad you're well," Mr. Wallace said, adjusting the lid of the garbage can. "Children need to play a lot, don't they? Enjoy the summer before school starts to get tougher." "Sure enough," Margaret agreed, eager to finish the conversation. "I have to go now or we'll be late. Have a nice day, Mr. Wallace." "You too, dear. And if you need anything, just call. I'm always at home." Margaret got into the car quickly, her heart pounding. There was something about the way he said "I'm always home" that sounded weird, or it would just be paranoia on her part. Margaret didn't know what else to think. He took Emma to school in silence, the quiet girl in the back seat looking out the window. But Emma kept avoiding the yard. More than that, the girl now also refused to do other things. On Friday, when Margaret asked Emma to go to the mailbox in front of the house to retrieve the letters, Emma immediately backed off. "Please, Mommy, can you take the cards?" she begged with wide eyes. "I don't want to go out there. Please." "Emma is just up ahead," Margaret said, confused. "It's 5 steps to the mailbox. Why don't you want to go?" "And if he's looking," Emma whispered, her hands clasped nervously in front of her body. "And if he sees me alone?" Margaret felt her heart tighten painfully. "Okay, my love," she said softly. "Mom picks up the letters. You stay here." And whenever Mr. Wallace appeared, whether in his garden or driving down the street, Emma disappeared. He ran to his room and locked the door. Or he hid in the bathroom. Or she pretended to be too busy with something that prevented her from being near windows. The behavior was consistent and worrying. Emma wasn't making it up. She was really afraid. And this fear was too real to be just imagination. On Saturday, Margaret decided she needed outside opinion. Maybe I was seeing things where there was nothing. Maybe he needed perspective. She decided to talk to other mothers in the neighborhood, mothers who had known Mr. Wallace for a longer time, who could confirm or deny the suspicions that were beginning to grow in her mind. On Monday afternoon, Margaret met up with Linda Patterson at the local mum's favorite coffee shop in the neighborhood, a cozy place called The Daily Grind that served aromatic coffee and delicious homemade cakes. Linda was the mother of 2 girls, one 10 and the other 12, and had lived in the neighborhood for almost 8 years. She knew pretty much everyone. She was the kind of sociable person who organized block parties and community events. "Linda," Margaret started after they ordered the coffees and sat at a table by the window, "you know Mr. Wallace well from the house next to mine." "Richard," Linda replied, stirring sugar into the coffee. "Of course, he has lived there for years, since before I moved here even." "Why?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Emma has been acting strangely in recent weeks. She says that Mr. Wallace watches her, that he stands at the window looking at her when he's playing in the backyard." Linda frowned, but then smiled reassuringly. "Margaret, Richard is completely harmless. He's just a lonely retired gentleman. His wife died 5 years ago, you knew. Breast cancer, it was very sad. He has no children, no family nearby. He lives alone in that big house. Maybe he just likes to see kids playing, you know. He must remember happier times, from when I had company." "But Emma is really frightened," Margaret insisted, her voice brimming with worry. "She refuses to leave the house. She trembles when she sees him. It's not just mild discomfort, Linda. It's real fear. Linda took Margaret's hand over the table, a comforting gesture. Look, I understand your concern. I really get it. Being a mother is living with your heart out of your chest. It is not. We want to protect our children from everything, but sometimes children have fears that don't make much sense. My youngest daughter had a phase where she was afraid of the postman. He cried every time he saw the post office truck. It took months for her to get over it, and there was nothing wrong with the postman. It was just a phase. Do you think that's all there is to it then? Margaret asked, wanting to believe it. Just a phase of Emma. I think so, Linda said with conviction. And look, Richard was always great with everyone. He helps the neighbors when they need it, takes care of Mrs. Henderson's cat when she travels, lends tools to those who need them. He's a good person, Margaret. Lonely, perhaps, but good. If it was something serious, someone else would have noticed it, isn't it? And as far as I know, no one has ever complained about him. Margaret wanted to believe this. He really wanted to. Linda's words were logical and comforting. Maybe Emma really was just going through a weird phase. Perhaps her fear had no real basis. But the discomfort in the back of Margaret's stomach did not disappear. That uncomfortable feeling that something wasn't right remained there, throbbing like a wound that won't heal. "Thank you, Linda," Margaret said, shaking back her friend's hand. "You helped me put things in perspective." "Whenever she needed it," Linda replied, smiling. "And look, if you're still worried, why don't you talk directly to Richard? He asks if he noticed anything strange, if he saw someone hanging around the houses. I'm sure he'll understand your concern as a mother and even help you keep an eye on things." Margaret nodded, but inside she knew she wouldn't do it. Not yet. Because if there was any chance, however slim, that his suspicions were correct, confronting Mr. Wallace directly could be dangerous. It could alert him that she was suspicious, and people who hide bad things become more careful when they know they're being watched. Over the next few days, Margaret tried to follow Linda's advice. He tried to be rational. He tried to believe that it was all imagination, that Emma was just going through a phase. But every time she saw her daughter huddled away from the windows, every time Emma refused to do anything that would put her in sight of the house next door, the worry came back in full force. And then the following Saturday, almost 2 weeks after all this strange behavior began, Margaret had her first real, concrete distrust. She was tidying up the groceries in the kitchen, putting vegetables in the fridge, cans in the cupboard, when she heard Emma scream. It was a short, high-pitched scream, filled with genuine terror. Margaret dropped everything and ran into the living room. He found his daughter standing in front of the window that overlooked the yard, her body rigid, her face pale as paper, her small hand pointing outward with a trembling finger. "He's looking at Mommy again," Emma screamed, her voice squeaky. "He always looks. I'm not making it up. Look over there, look." Margaret followed the direction Emma was pointing. She looked next door at the second-floor window that her daughter had mentioned earlier. And this time, unlike the other times, there was someone there. Margaret could clearly see the silhouette of a man behind the partially open white curtain, Mr. Wallace. He was standing there, completely still, and even with the distance and the curtain, Margaret had the clear feeling that he was looking directly at where Emma used to play in the yard. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. His hands went cold. For a brief second, just a second, she saw exactly what Emma had been saying. He saw the man at the window watching. But then, almost immediately, Mr. Wallace stepped aside and disappeared from view. The curtain became immobile again. The window was empty. "Emma," Margaret began, her voice coming out shaky, "he's just looking around his yard, darling. He wasn't looking specifically at you. Maybe he was just admiring the beautiful weather, checking if it was going to rain." "But he does look, Mommy," Emma insisted. And now tears were beginning to flow down her face. "When you're not here, when I'm alone." "He stays there for a long time, just looking. And it makes me feel bad, Mom. It makes me feel afraid." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. She pulled Emma into a tight embrace, feeling the girl tremble against her body. "All right, my love, all right," Margaret murmured, but her own hands trembled now. "You won't play alone outside anymore, okay? Whenever she wants to go out, Mom goes along. And we're going to keep the curtains closed so no one can see into our house." Emma nodded against her mother's chest, her sobs gradually diminishing. "Do you believe me now, Mommy?" she asked in a muffled voice. "Can you believe he looks at me?" "I believe, dear," Margaret said, and this time there was no doubt in the voice. "I believe in you." And it was true. Margaret had seen it with her own eyes. Mr. Wallace was at the window. I was looking, and even if there was an innocent explanation, even if he really was just looking at his own garden or checking the weather, the fact remained. Emma felt threatened. Emma was afraid. And children don't invent this kind of fear. They don't invent the trembling in the hands, the panic in the eyes, the night nightmares. Something was causing it, and Margaret needed to find out what. That would be true. It would be just a coincidence. It would be a child's imagination that made him misinterpret an innocent situation. Or it would be something much, much worse. Margaret decided she needed to pay more attention. He could no longer rely only on what others said. He could no longer accept that everything was fine, just because no one else saw a problem. Emma was his daughter. Emma was scared, and Margaret had a responsibility to find out if this fear had any real foundation. If this revelation is arousing in you a deep curiosity about what really happened, comment right now. I want more stories, and please leave your like in this video. Margaret couldn't sleep that Saturday night. She lay on the dark bed, tossing and turning between the sheets, her mind working non-stop. He thought of Emma's words. He thought of the man he had seen at the window. I thought of all the times Emma had shown fear, and she, Margaret, had minimized it. I thought about how I had almost believed that it was just a child's imagination, just a passing phase. But what if it wasn't? What if there was something real going on, and she was failing to protect her daughter? At 5 in the morning, when the sky was beginning to clear with the first rays of sunshine on Sunday, Margaret gave up sleeping. He got up, made strong coffee, sat down at the kitchen table with his laptop, and began to think rationally. If Emma was telling the truth, if Mr. Wallace was really watching the girl inappropriately, Margaret needed hard evidence. He could not go to the police with the word of an 8-year-old child alone. I couldn't accuse a respected neighbor without solid evidence. I needed to document. I needed to be absolutely sure. On Monday morning, after taking Emma to school, Margaret went to an electronics store in downtown Portland. He bought 2 small security cameras, the kind that can be easily installed and that records continuously, saving the images on a memory card. They were discreet, black and small cameras, which could be positioned without attracting too much attention. Margaret also bought a tablet so she could watch the recordings easily. At home, Margaret spent the morning installing the cameras. He placed one in the corner of the yard, pointed toward the area where Emma used to play, but positioned so that it also captured the house next door, especially the second-story window Emma had mentioned. He placed the second camera in the living room window, hidden behind a plant, also facing Mr. Wallace's house. If he was really watching Emma, if he really stood at the window watching, the cameras would record everything, and Margaret would have proof. For the next 3 days, Margaret reviewed the recordings every night. Emma waited for sleep, locked herself in her room, connected the tablet to the system and watched hours of filming. I saw hours of empty yard, swaying slightly in the breeze. I saw birds perching on the grass, squirrels running across the fence. I saw leaves swaying in the trees. But he did not see Mr. Wallace. I didn't see him in the window. I didn't see anything suspicious. The house next door seemed quiet and normal. The curtains of the second-story window remained closed most of the time. Sometimes they opened briefly. But Margaret never saw anyone there. No face, no figures watching. Margaret began to feel foolish. There was a money on security cameras. I was spending hours every night watching recordings of nothing. Maybe Linda was right. Perhaps Mr. Wallace was really just a lonely, harmless gentleman. Maybe Emma was really just going through a strange phase of childish fears. Margaret almost gave up. Almost. Until Tuesday night, while reviewing the afternoon recording, Margaret saw something that made her blood run cold. The picture was clear. The time in the corner of the screen showed 3:45 p.m., the time Emma normally came home from school. Margaret saw herself on the tape entering the house through the back door with Emma, both carrying backpacks and purses. I saw Emma running into the house. She saw herself following her daughter, and then, less than 5 minutes later, he saw the second-floor window of the house next door open. I saw Mr. Wallace appear there, and he wasn't just casually staring out the window. He had binoculars, large, professional black binoculars, and he was pointing them directly at the Harrisons' backyard. Where Emma used to play. Where would the girl be if she hadn't developed this paralyzing fear of leaving the house? Margaret felt nausea rise in her throat. His hands trembled so much that the tablet almost fell to the floor. The recording was replayed, and again, and again. There was no doubt. Mr. Wallace was at the window with binoculars watching their yard, observing the place where an 8-year-old girl should be playing. That was not normal. This was not a lonely gentleman just admiring the neighborhood. That was surveillance. That was an intentional observation of a child. Margaret felt the bile rise, her stomach turn. He ran to the bathroom and vomited, his body shaking violently. Then she washed her face with ice water, looked at her own reflection in the mirror. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "You're not crazy," she whispered to herself. Emma wasn't making it up. "You have proof now. You saw it." He was watching, with binoculars, watching where your daughter plays. But what to do now? Margaret went back to the room, picked up the tablet again, and watched the recording once more. Mr. Wallace stood at the window for nearly 15 minutes, with his binoculars pointed at the Harrisons' yard. 15 full minutes. I wasn't checking the time. He wasn't looking at birds. It was specifically focused on their backyard. And then, as if realizing it was taking too long, he put down his binoculars and walked away from the window. The curtain closed. The window was empty. Margaret knew she needed more evidence. Binoculars alone did not prove crime. Mr. Wallace could claim that he was birdwatching, that he was checking to see if there were any animals invading the yards, that it was just an innocent hobby. The police probably wouldn't do anything with just a recording of someone wearing binoculars in their own window. Margaret needed to find out more. I needed to understand what was really happening. Why did he watch Emma specifically? What he wanted? What were his intentions? On Wednesday morning, after taking Emma to school, Margaret decided she needed to know more about Mr. Wallace. I needed information about his past, about who he really was. He sat down at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. She started by researching his name on social networks. Richard Wallace. He found a profile with little public information. The photo showed a middle-aged man smiling in front of a house, probably the same house where he now lived. There were some old photos, most of them with a woman who must have been his deceased wife. Photos of trips, dinners, everyday moments of an apparently happy couple. There were no recent posts, just old content from years ago. Nothing there seemed suspicious. Nothing there indicated danger. But Margaret did not give up. He searched on other platforms. He researched his name along with Portland, Oregon. He found a mention in a community newsletter from years ago about him donating money to the local library. Another mention in a newspaper article about gardening, where he had given tips on how to care for roses. Everything seemed normal, even pleasant. A respectable citizen contributing to the community. So Margaret decided to dig deeper. It entered public records websites, those that allow you to search for information about anyone using only the name. In the first search in Oregon, nothing came up but his current address and basic information. But then Margaret remembered that Linda had mentioned that he had lived there for years. Before Oregon, he had lived where? Margaret began to search in other states. Washington, nothing. California, nothing. Nevada, nothing. Montana, nothing. Until he typed Idaho and hit enter. The screen loaded for a few seconds that seemed eternal, and then a result appeared that made Margaret's heart stop completely. Richard Arthur Wallace. Previous living in Boise, Idaho from 2008 to 2010, and below, in smaller but perfectly legible letters, was a line that chilled the blood in Margaret's veins. Police occurrence registered in September 2009. Investigation for inappropriate behavior involving a minor. Case filed for lack of sufficient evidence for indictment. Margaret read that line 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it echoing in her ears. His hands trembled on the keyboard. Inappropriate behavior involving minors. Mr. Wallace, the polite, smiling neighbor, the man everyone in the neighborhood considered harmless, had been investigated for something involving a child 15 years ago. Margaret clicked on the link for more details, but there wasn't much more information publicly available. It only confirmed that an investigation had been opened after a complaint from a family, that the case was taken to the local police department, that interviews were carried out, but that in the end the charges were dropped because there was not enough concrete evidence to move the case forward. The record said the family had moved out of town shortly after the case was filed. Margaret felt nausea rise. He closed his laptop and ran to the bathroom, kneeling in front of the toilet, his stomach turned, his head spinning. He vomited, his body shaking violently. Then she sat there on the cold bathroom floor, her back against the wall, taking a deep breath, trying to calm down. His worst nightmare was being confirmed. The man who lived next door to her house, a few meters away from her daughter, had a history. He had been investigated for something involving a child. And even if the charges had been dropped, even if he had not been convicted, the fact remained. There were suspicions, there was smoke, and where there is smoke, there is usually fire. Margaret washed her face with ice water, looked at her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. His eyes were wide, frightened. His face was as pale as paper. Emma wasn't making it up. Emma was right to be afraid. That man was dangerous. Margaret knew this now with every fiber of her being. The maternal instinct that she had almost ignored, that she had almost suppressed because other people said she was exaggerating, that instinct was screaming now, screaming that her daughter was in danger, screaming that she needed to act. But what to do? Margaret went back to the kitchen and sat down again at the table, her head in her hands. If he were to go to the police now, what would he say? That his neighbor was wearing binoculars in his own window. That he had a record of investigation from 15 years ago that resulted in nothing. That his 8-year-old daughter was afraid of him. That would be enough. Margaret doubted. The police would probably say that binoculars were not a crime, that the old record did not prove anything current, that fear of children was not evidence. They would say that she was being overprotective, paranoid perhaps, that she should talk to a child therapist about her daughter's fears instead of accusing a respectable neighbor. Margaret needed more. I needed concrete, irrefutable proof that Mr. Wallace was doing something wrong. He needed something that the police couldn't ignore. And there was only one way to achieve this. I needed to enter his house. I needed to see what was inside. I needed to find out what that man was hiding. It was risky. It was technically illegal. Invasion of property was a crime. If she was caught, she could be arrested. He could lose custody of Emma. He could destroy his own life trying to protect his daughter. But what if I did nothing? And if he let it go? What if Mr. Wallace really did mean badly and she, Margaret, didn't act to prevent it? How would I live with this guilt for the rest of my life? How he would look at Emma, knowing that he could have protected her, but he didn't, because he was afraid of the consequences for himself? No, Margaret couldn't live with it. She would rather risk everything, would rather face the legal consequences, would rather be arrested if necessary than leave her daughter vulnerable to a predator, because that was what Mr. Wallace was. Margaret was sure now. A predator. A man who watched children, who collected images of them, who waited for opportunities. And Margaret would be the only thing between him and Emma. It would be the guardian. She would be the protector. Even if it meant crossing lines you never imagined crossing. Margaret spent the whole Sunday planning. Emma was sleeping at Grandma Dorothy's house, something Margaret had arranged by saying she needed to work an extra shift at the hospital. In fact, Margaret needed time alone to think, to plan, to prepare herself mentally for what she was about to do. She sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen and began to write down everything she knew about Mr. Wallace's routine. He left every Monday at 9 in the morning, always at the same time, punctual as clockwork. Margaret had observed this in recent weeks. He would get into the car, an old but well-maintained silver sedan, and drive toward the city centre. He usually returned around 10:30, sometimes 11 o'clock. Margaret assumed that he went to the supermarket or did other weekly shopping. An hour and a half. Enough time for her to enter the house, look for evidence, and leave before he returns. But how to get in? Margaret didn't know how to pick locks. I didn't have the tools to do that. He had no invasion skills. She was just a nurse, a mother, an ordinary woman who had never done anything illegal in her life, other than occasionally parking in a prohibited spot. So I would have to find another way, maybe an open window, maybe an unlocked back door. People sometimes forgot to lock everything up, especially in neighborhoods that were considered safe. And if she was caught. Margaret wrote that down as well. If Mr. Wallace came back early and found her inside his house, if a neighbor saw her entering, if something went wrong, what would be the plan? Margaret decided that if she was confronted, she would tell the truth. He would say that he was protecting his daughter. I would say about Emma's fear, about the binocular recordings, about the Idaho record. I would let the consequences come. He would rather explain his actions than explain his inaction. Margaret also decided that she would not go completely alone. She needed someone who knew what she was doing, someone who could call for help if something went wrong. He thought of Linda Patterson. Linda had been quick to defend Mr. Wallace before, but she was also a mother, a fundamentally good person. If Margaret explained everything, showed the evidence she had, maybe Linda would understand. Maybe it would help. That Sunday night, Margaret called Linda. The conversation was long and difficult. Margaret explained about the Idaho registration. He explained about the recording of the binoculars. He explained about Emma's visceral and constant fear. He explained about the need to find out the truth. Linda was silent for a long time after Margaret finished speaking. "Margaret," Linda finally said, voice full of worry, "what you are planning is very dangerous. It is illegal. You know that. You don't know." "I know," Margaret replied, her voice steady in spite of the fear she felt. "But Linda, what if it's true? And if he really is what I think he is? And if there are other children at risk? I can't sit idly by. I can't. This is my daughter, and she's scared, and I trust her." Linda sighed. A long, tired sigh. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to know what I'm doing," Margaret said. "I'm going to go into his house tomorrow morning when he leaves. If you don't hear from me within 30 minutes, call the police. Tell us everything. Tell me where I am. Don't let me disappear without someone knowing. Margaret, you're scaring me," Linda said, her voice shaking now. "You really think he's that dangerous?" "I think so, Linda," Margaret replied. "And if I'm wrong, if it's all just a terrible misunderstanding, I'll accept the consequences. I'm going to apologize. I will pay whatever is necessary. But if I'm right, if he really is a threat, then I need to find out now before it's too late." "Okay," Linda said finally. "I'll do what you asked. But please, Margaret, be careful. Be very careful." "I'll have it," Margaret promised and hung up the phone. On Monday morning, Margaret woke up at 6 o'clock, even though she had hardly slept at all during the night. He took a shower, put on dark and comfortable clothes, jeans, and a black long-sleeved blouse. He ate a piece of toast even though he wasn't hungry, just because he knew he needed energy. He drank strong coffee. She checked her cell phone dozens of times, nervous, anxious, scared, but determined. At 8:45, Margaret stood at the living room window, hidden behind the curtain, looking at the house next door. At exactly 9 o'clock as usual, Mr. Wallace walked out the front door. He wore khaki pants and a light blue polo shirt. He was carrying a reusable shopping bag, confirming that he was probably going to the supermarket. He got in the car, started it, left the garage and drove down the street until he disappeared on the corner. Margaret waited a full 5 minutes, timing it on her phone to be absolutely sure he wouldn't come back because he'd forgotten something. Then he took out his cell phone, sent a message to Linda saying, "I'm going now," and left through the back door of the house. He walked quickly through the yard, past the low fence that separated the properties, and entered Mr. Wallace's yard. Margaret's heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. His hands were sweating, his legs trembled. Every step felt wrong, felt like a violation, a transgression of all the rules she had followed her whole life. But he kept walking. He approached the back door of Mr. Wallace's house. He tried the doorknob. Locked. Of course it would be locked. What kind of person leaves home leaving doors open? Margaret went around the house, checking every window on the ground floor. All locked. All closed. He began to feel despair growing up. Maybe I couldn't get in. Maybe I would have to give up and leave empty-handed. But then, on the side of the house, he found a kitchen window that was ajar. Just a few inches, enough to let fresh air in, but small enough that most people wouldn't notice. Margaret pushed the window with both hands. It opened easily without making a sound. Margaret looked around, checking to see if any neighbors were watching. The street was silent. It was weekday, morning. Most people were at work or busy inside their own homes. No one paid attention to what was happening in Mr. Wallace's backyard. Margaret took a deep breath, put her hands on the windowsill, and with effort managed to hoist herself up. He ran a leg out of the window, then the other, and then it was in. He stepped on the floor of Mr. Wallace's kitchen, his legs almost failing under the weight of accomplishing what he was doing. It was inside someone else's house, without permission. I was committing a crime. She could be arrested for that. But there was no turning back now. He had already crossed the line. He could only move on. The house inside seemed ordinary and even cozy. The kitchen was clean and organized, washed dishes drying in the colander next to the sink. A tea towel hangs on the oven door. The refrigerator had some magnets with pictures, old images of Mr. Wallace and his wife in happy moments. Everything seemed completely normal. Nothing there indicated danger. Margaret walked slowly from the kitchen to the living room. Antique but well-maintained furniture, a worn-out but comfortable brown leather sofa, an old model television on top of a wooden rack, shelves with books mostly about gardening and photography, framed photographs on the walls, almost all of his deceased wife. Mr. Wallace standing next to her in front of a waterfall. The two sat in a restaurant toasting with glasses of wine, the wife smiling in a garden full of flowers, images of a life that seemed to have been good and normal. Margaret felt a twinge of doubt. Maybe I really was wrong. Perhaps Mr. Wallace was just a lonely widower living with memories of the past. Perhaps the recordings of the binoculars had an innocent explanation. Perhaps the Idaho record was a misunderstanding, a false accusation from years ago that ruined an innocent man's reputation. Maybe she, Margaret, was the wrong person here, invading someone's privacy based only on suspicion and fear. But then Margaret remembered Emma's face. She remembered the tremor in her daughter's hands. He remembered the tears in his blue eyes. She remembered the pleading voice saying, "Please, Mommy, don't make me leave. Children do not invent this kind of fear. They do not feign genuine terror." Emma was scared for a reason, and Margaret needed to find out what that reason was. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking softly beneath his feet. The second-floor corridor had 3 doors. Margaret opened the first one. It was the master bedroom, clearly where Mr. Wallace slept. A double bed made with a dark blue duvet. Nightstands on each side, a wooden wardrobe against the wall. Everything clean, organized, with nothing out of place. Margaret opened the drawers of the nightstand. Just normal stuff. Reading glasses, a book in half, high blood pressure medicines, an old alarm clock. He closed the door and opened the second. A small office, a wooden table with a desktop computer, a swivel chair, shelves with more books and file folders. Margaret sat down in the chair and moved the mouse. The computer screen lit up, but asked for a password. Margaret had no way to access it. He looked around the table. Papers with paid bills, a calendar with notes on medical appointments. Nothing suspicious. Margaret got up and went to the third door. It was the door to the bedroom that faced the Harrisons' backyard, the room from which Emma said she saw Mr. Wallace watching. Margaret put her hand on the doorknob and hesitated for a moment. Some part of her knew that whatever was behind that door would change everything. There would be no turning back. There would be no way to pretend that he did not see it. But I needed to see it. I needed to know. Margaret turned the handle and pushed the door down slowly. The room was dark, the curtains closed, blocking the sunlight. Margaret groped at the wall, looking for the switch. He found it and turned on the light. And then what he saw made his blood run cold completely, made his legs give way, made a scream get stuck in his throat. The walls were covered with photographs, not just a few, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, and they were all children's. Girls. Most appeared to be between 6 and 12 years old. The photos were hung in neat rows, like a macabre exhibition. Some photographs were clearly taken from afar, with powerful zoom lenses. Children playing in backyards, children entering and leaving schools, children in public parks, on the swings, on the slides, completely oblivious to what they were being photographed. Margaret walked into the room in shock, her legs wobbly, her breathing quickening. He approached the walls and looked more closely. He recognized some of the children. They were girls from the neighborhood, the Henderson's daughter, the Rodriguez twins, Mrs. Peterson's niece who visited on weekends. And then, in the center of the larger wall, there was an entire section dedicated to Emma. Margaret brought her trembling hand to her mouth to drown out a scream of horror. There were at least 20 photographs of Emma. Emma playing in the backyard, Emma on the blue swing, Emma inside the little pink house. Emma leaving home in the morning with her backpack on her way to school. Emma at the bedroom window looking out. Some photos were from weeks ago, when Emma was still playing outside. Others were more recent. The last, Margaret could see from the clothes Emma was wearing, had been taken only 3 days before. Margaret felt as if she were going to vomit, but forced herself to keep looking. He forced himself to document everything. He picked up his cell phone with hands shaking so much that he could barely hold it. He began to photograph the walls. Click. Emma's photos. Click. The photos of the other girls. Click. The obsessive organization. Click. Everything. Every detail. Below the photos was a long table with a laptop. Margaret walked up there, breathing fast, her heart racing. He touched the laptop mouse. The screen lit up, and to Margaret's shock, there was no password. The screen opened directly, showing what Mr. Wallace had been doing before he left the house. The computer was open on a website that Margaret recognized by the news as being part of the dark web, that part of the internet used for illegal activities. It was a forum. Margaret saw messages exchanged between users with coded names, strange combinations of letters and numbers, and Mr. Wallace, under the username RW5683, was actively participating. Margaret scrolled through the messages, her nausea growing with each line she read. The messages talked about opportunities, about children from suburban neighborhoods, about parents who work and leave children vulnerable, about the best times for observation, about discreet photography techniques. And Mr. Wallace was sharing photos, not just Emma, of several children in the neighborhood. There were dozens of images uploaded over the past few months. And even scarier, there were posts where Mr. Wallace and other forum users were planning. discussing ways to create opportunities for direct contact, talking about gaining trust, about offering help, about waiting for the right moment. Margaret read a message from Mr. Wallace dated just 2 days earlier that said her mother works night shifts on weekends. The girl is alone for a few hours. Maybe it's my chance soon. Margaret could no longer hold on. He ran to the bathroom in the hallway and vomited, his whole body shaking violently. He was planning something. I was waiting for an opportunity to do something with Emma, with his daughter, with her 8-year-old girl. If Margaret hadn't figured it out, if Emma hadn't trusted her enough to express her fear, if Margaret hadn't followed her instincts, something terrible might have happened. Margaret washed her face, forced herself to breathe, forced herself to go back to that horrible room. He needed all the evidence possible. He returned to his laptop and began to photograph the screen, the forum page, the messages, usernames, everything. He also photographed the folders saved on the computer, which had hard-coded names but clearly contained more images. He photographed everything he could, his fingers sliding frantically over the screen of his cell phone. That's when he heard the sound of a car in the driveway. Margaret froze, her blood running cold in her veins. No, it was too soon. Mr. Wallace was not supposed to be back for at least another half hour, but the sound was unmistakable. A car pulling into the garage, a car door closing, footsteps approaching the front door. Margaret was imprisoned on the second floor. There was no way to go down the stairs and leave without him seeing her. There was no way out. She thought about hiding in the closet under the bed anywhere, but then he looked again at Emma's pictures on the wall, for the pictures of all those innocent girls, for the messages on the computer planning horror, and something inside Margaret changed. Anger replaced fear. Determination burned harder than panic. She wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to run away. I was going to confront that monster. I was going to look him in the eye and say I knew that he had seen it all, that he would not let him hurt any child ever again. Margaret went down the stairs slowly, deliberately, her cell phone clutched in her hand. He heard the front door open, heard Mr. Wallace come in, heard him say out loud, as if talking to himself or maybe hoping to scare her if she was hiding, "Hello, there's someone there. I know there's someone here." Margaret reached the end of the stairs and stopped in the hallway. Mr. Wallace was standing there, standing by the front door, and when he saw her, his face went through a rapid series of expressions. Surprise, confusion, and then something much darker. Anger, perhaps, or calculation. The mask of a gentle neighbor fell completely, and Margaret saw for the first time what was hidden behind. "Margaret," he said, her voice losing all feigned gentleness, becoming cold and hard. "What are you doing in my house?" "I saw the room upstairs, Richard," Margaret said, and was struck by how firm her own voice sounded despite the terror she felt. "I saw everything. The children's photos, my daughter's photos. I saw the computer, the messages. I know exactly what you are." His face hardened even more. He took a step toward her, and Margaret saw his hands clench into fists. "You shouldn't have come in here," he said, every word laden with menace. "This is invasion of property. You can be arrested for it. You committed a crime. And you have committed far worse crimes," Margaret screamed, all the tension and fear of the past few weeks exploding into fury. "You have pictures of children, photos he took without permission, photos of my 8-year-old daughter. You are on illegal forums on the internet. You're planning to hurt children. My daughter was right to be afraid of you. I was right to be suspicious. You are a monster, Richard, a predator, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows that." Mr. Wallace took another step toward Margaret, and this time there was something dangerous in her eyes, something that made Margaret instinctively recoil. But she forced herself to stand firm, not to show the fear she felt. "You're not going to show these pictures to anyone, Margaret," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Do you know why? Because you broke into my house illegally. Any evidence you have is inadmissible in court. And I'm going to sue you for trespassing. I will say that you are an unbalanced and paranoid mother. I will say that you made it all up because you have mental problems. I will destroy your reputation. I'm going to make you lose custody of your daughter." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. He was right about one thing. The evidence she had illegally collected might not serve in court. A good lawyer could argue that they were obtained illicitly. But Margaret had thought of it. He had prepared for this possibility. "I'm not alone, Richard," Margaret said, keeping her voice as steady as she could despite the fear that his hand might reach her. "I warned someone before coming. He said where he would be and what he was doing. If I don't hear from you soon, that person will call the police. It will tell everything. And I've already sent the photos I took of your room to several people by email. Even if you try to delete something, even if you try to stop me, it's already too late. The evidence has already left this house. It was a lie, or at least partially a lie." Margaret had texted Linda that she was entering the house, but had not sent the photos yet. He had not sent anything beyond that initial message. But Mr. Wallace did not know this. And by the way her face turned pale slightly, by the way her eyes widened, Margaret saw that the lie had worked. "You don't know what you did," Mr. Wallace said, and now there was a note of despair in his voice beyond anger. "You don't know who I know, the connections I have. You're going to regret that, Margaret. You will regret it a lot. The only people who will regret something are those who trusted you," Margaret replied. "The neighbors who thought you were harmless. The families who let their daughters play near you. And you, Richard, you'll regret every photo you took, every message you wrote, every horrible thought you had about innocent children." At that moment, they heard something that made Margaret feel a surge of relief so intense that her legs almost failed. Sirens! In the distance, but approaching quickly. Linda had complied. He had called the police. Margaret had said she would hear back in 30 minutes and clearly hadn't, so Linda assumed something was wrong and took action. Mr. Wallace's face changed completely when he heard the sirens. What was once anger and threat turned into panic. He looked at the door, then at Margaret, then again at the door. Margaret saw the exact moment when he considered running away, when the idea of running and trying to escape crossed his mind. But it was too late. The sirens were on the street now, loud and clear. "You don't know what you did," he repeated. But now his voice was weak, defeated. "You didn't have the right. You invaded my privacy. You didn't have the right." "I had every right to protect my daughter," Margaret said, and now tears were beginning to fall down her face, tears of relief and anger and fear released. "I had every right to find out if the man who lived next door to my house was a threat. And you're Richard. You are everything I feared you were." 2 police cars stopped in front of the house with sudden braking. Margaret saw by the red and blue lights flashing through the window. 4 police officers quickly left, hands on guns in holsters, ready for any situation. Margaret ran to the front door and opened it wide before the officers had to break in. "I'm here," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I'm here, and so is he. Please come in." The police quickly entered, assessing the situation. A woman in uniform, older and with an experienced look, stepped forward. "I'm Detective Sarah Collins," she said in a firm, controlled voice. "We received an emergency call from a Linda Patterson saying that a friend of hers was in danger at this address." "What's happening here?" Margaret took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak clearly and coherently despite the trembling in her body. "My name is Margaret Harrison. I live next door. I entered this house without permission. I know this is illegal, and I accept the consequences. But I needed to find out the truth about this man. He's Richard Wallace. He's been watching my 8-year-old daughter. I recorded him using binoculars from his window, pointed at where she plays. She developed an intense fear of leaving the house because of him. And when I looked up his name, I found out that 15 years ago he was investigated in Idaho for inappropriate behavior involving a minor. The case was archived, but the record exists." Margaret paused, gasping for air, and continued, her voice growing louder. "And when I walked into his house today, I found something terrible in the second-floor bedroom. There are hundreds of pictures of children on the walls, girls from our neighborhood, photos taken without permission, from afar, with zoom, and there's a whole section dedicated to my daughter. Photos of her playing, leaving the house in the bedroom window. And there's a computer up there open on an illegal forum where he was sharing photos and planning to do terrible things. I photographed everything with my cell phone. I have proof. Detective Collins looked at Mr. Wallace, who had stood completely pale and motionless near the stairs. "Mr. Wallace," she said, in an authoritative voice, "I need you to stay exactly where you are. Do not move. Based on Ms. Harrison's complaint, we have an emergency search warrant to search this property on suspicion of criminal behavior involving minors." "This is absurd," Mr. Wallace said, but his voice came out weak, without conviction. "This woman broke into my house. She's the criminal here. She's making things up. She's crazy, obsessed, paranoid. Let's check it out," Detective Collins said calmly. She signaled to two of the officers. "Go up and check the second floor, especially the room that Mrs. Harrison mentioned. Document everything you find." The two officers quickly climbed the stairs. Margaret stood in the drawing room with Detective Collins and a third officer who had positioned himself near Mr. Wallace, clearly ready to act if he tried to flee. Margaret sat on the couch, her legs finally giving way completely, her whole body shaking with the rush of adrenaline. "If you're here, it's because this story deserves to be heard. I believe that what comes next will surprise you even more. Don't leave this video before you find out how it all ended." 5 minutes passed in tense silence. Margaret could hear the cops walking upstairs, opening doors, moving things. I could see Mr. Wallace growing paler with each passing second, and then one of the policemen appeared at the top of the stairs, his face serious and distraught. "Detective Collins," he called, his voice controlled but clearly affected by what he had seen. "You need to see that." Detective Collins quickly climbed the stairs. Margaret sat waiting, her heart in her throat. It took another 5 minutes before the detective came down again, and when she did, her face was pale, and there was an expression of deep disturbance in her eyes. "Mr. Richard Wallace," Detective Collins said, in a firm and official voice, "you are under arrest for possession and distribution of illegal material involving minors, for unlawful surveillance, and for conspiracy to commit crimes against children. You have the right to remain silent. Everything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to a lawyer. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be assigned by the state. You understand these rights." Mr. Wallace tried to protest. He started saying something about his rights, about suing everyone, but his voice was swallowed up by the sound of handcuffs being placed on his wrists. The officers took him out of the house while he shouted about injustice, about invasion of privacy, about how he knew important people. But none of that mattered anymore. He was in prison. He was being taken. It was finished. Margaret watched through the window as they put Mr. Wallace in the back seat of one of the police cars. She saw the lights flashing. She saw neighbors starting to leave their houses, attracted by the commotion. She saw the car leave, carrying that man who had threatened her daughter. And then it collapsed. He fell to his knees there on the living room floor, sobbing, all the terror and tension and fear of the last few weeks finally being released. Detective Collins crouched down next to Margaret, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Margaret," she said softly, "what you did was incredibly dangerous, incredibly risky, and technically illegal. You trespassed on private property. This is a crime. You could be sued for that." "I know," Margaret said between sobs. "I know. But he was planning to hurt my daughter. I needed to find out. I needed to be sure." "I understand," the detective said, and her voice was gentle but firm. "And I need you to know that what we found up there, Margaret, it's one of the most disturbing things I've seen in 20 years of police work. That room had hundreds of photos, not just your daughter's. We identified at least 15 different children from the neighborhood, all girls between the ages of 6 and 12, and the computer has evidence of serious criminal activity, connections with other predators, exchange of illegal material, crime planning. We will need your full testimony from the recordings you have of everything that led him to suspect him. Margaret nodded, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand. I'm going to give everything I've got. Everything. He goes to prison. It will stay there. With what we found today, Detective Collins said, getting up and helping Margaret get up too. Yes, he's going to prison. For a long time. And we will investigate if there are other victims in other places where he lived. The Idaho record you found was very helpful. We will reopen that case too. See if we can connect the dots. And about me breaking into his house, Margaret asked, her voice still trembling. I'm going to be arrested. The detective sighed. Technically, you committed a crime. Yes, but considering the extreme circumstances, considering that you were acting to protect your daughter from a real and imminent threat, considering that your action led to the discovery of a larger criminal operation, I will personally recommend to the prosecutor that no charges be brought against you. I can't guarantee anything, but I think it's very unlikely that you'll face legal consequences. And even if he does, any judge with a conscience would take his motivations into account. Margaret felt an immense relief wash over her. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you very much. You were brave, Margaret, the detective said. Incredibly brave. And he saved his daughter, possibly saved several other children as well. He should be proud of that. I just want Emma to be safe, Margaret said, her voice breaking. Is that it? I just want to protect my daughter. And he succeeded, the detective replied. She's safe now. You have secured that. Margaret left Mr. Wallace's house in shock. He gave his full statement to the police, showed all the photos he had taken with his cell phone, handed over the recordings of the security cameras he had installed at home. He spent hours answering questions, recounting every detail, every moment that led to the decision to enter that house. And then, finally, when the sun was already setting and the sky was turning orange and pink, Margaret was released to leave. He drove straight to his mother Dorothy's house, where Emma was. He barely managed to get out of the car when he arrived. His legs were weak, his hands were shaking uncontrollably, his heart was beating out of rhythm. Every muscle in the body ached as if it had run a marathon, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except seeing Emma, holding Emma, making sure her daughter was okay. Dorothy opened the door before Margaret even knocked, her face scarred with worry. Margaret, my God, what happened? She asked, her eyes wide. Linda called me and said there were police on her street, that you were involved in something. Are you okay? She is hurt. I'm fine, Mum, Margaret said, her voice hoarse from talking so much during the testimony. I am fine. I just need Emma. Please. Emma appeared running from the back room, where she had been watching cartoons. Mum, she cried out happily, still completely oblivious to everything that had happened. Grandma made cookies. Want to try it? Emma jumped into Margaret's arms, and Margaret held her tightly, so tight that Emma gave a small sigh of surprise. But the girl did not complain. She just snuggled into her mother's embrace, her little arms wrapping around Margaret's neck. Margaret buried her face in her daughter's blonde hair and began to cry silently, tears of relief and gratitude and overwhelming love streaming down her face. It's okay now, my love, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. It's okay. You're safe. You've always been right to be afraid. I should have believed you from the beginning. Forgive me for taking so long to understand. Emma pulled away from the hug a little and looked into her mother's red and swollen eyes with confusion. Mommy, why are you crying? Something happened. Margaret wiped away her tears quickly and forced a smile. It happened, yes, dear. But it was a good thing. Mr. Wallace, he will no longer bother us. He left and will not return. You don't have to be afraid of him anymore. Never again. Emma's face lit up with understanding and hope. Really, Mom, he will no longer look at me out the window. It won't make me afraid anymore. Truly, my love, Margaret confirmed, pulling her daughter into another tight hug. He was gone forever. Mum assured that. You are completely safe now. And I'm sorry, so sorry that I didn't understand before how scared you were. You tried to tell me, and I almost didn't believe it, but I believe in you, Emma. I will always believe. If something or someone makes you uncomfortable, if someone makes you afraid, you always tell me, and I'll always listen to you. I will always protect you. Emma began to cry too, but it was not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of freedom, of finally being able to express the fear I had carried alone for so long. I was so afraid, Mommy. She sobbed against Margaret's chest. But I didn't know how to explain it properly. I thought you were going to say it was silly. I thought no one would believe me. It's never silly, Emma, Margaret said firmly, holding her daughter's face in her hands and looking straight into her blue eyes. If something makes you afraid, if something makes you feel bad, you always tell me. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter who the person is. I will always listen to you. I will always investigate. I will always protect you. That I promise. This story is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because you want to know the truth behind the facts. You are ready for the final reveal. Over the next few weeks, Margaret discovered the full extent of Richard Wallace's crimes, and each new piece of information she received from the police made her stomach churn again. The investigation revealed that his computer contained not only the photos of the children in the neighborhood, but also connections to an international network of people involved in crimes against minors. Mr. Wallace had been in this network for years, perhaps decades. He regularly communicated with other predators, exchanged photos, shared techniques, discussed targets. Detective Collins called Margaret a week after the arrest to give her an update. We found out that Wallace has moved from town to town over the past 20 years, she explained. He lived in Idaho, as you discovered, in Montana before that, in Washington before that, always settling near schools or in neighborhoods with many young families. And there were always suspicions, there were always complaints from concerned parents, but there was never enough evidence. Until now. The record in Idaho that Margaret had found was not the only one. There were other investigations in Oregon, 2 in Washington, 1 in Montana, but Richard Wallace always managed to escape. There was always a lack of hard evidence. Families who reported often gave up because they did not want to expose their children to the trauma of a long and painful court case. Wallace knew this. I explored that. It relied on the fact that parents want to protect their children from public exposure as much as they want to protect them from predators. But now, with the evidence found in his home, with the hundreds of photographs, with the digital computer records showing years of criminal activity, there was no escape. The prosecution had a solid and irrefutable case. Wallace would be convicted. The only question was, for how long? Margaret also discovered something that left her simultaneously relieved and disgusted. In most cases, including Emma's, Wallace had failed to go beyond observation and photographs. He was planning, waiting for the perfect moment, studying patterns and routines, but Margaret had stopped him before he could act. The message on the computer about Emma being alone when Margaret worked night shifts had been written just 2 days before the discovery. He was preparing to make his first attempt at direct contact. If Margaret had waited another week, a few more days even, perhaps the story would have had a different ending. But he didn't wait. He trusted his instinct. He trusted Emma, and he acted. Linda Patterson was the first neighbor to reach out to Margaret after word spread through the neighborhood. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after Wallace's arrest. Margaret heard the doorbell ring, and when she opened the door, she found Linda standing there under an umbrella, her face marked with tears and guilt. "Margaret," Linda said, voice breaking, "I need to apologize to you. When you asked me about Wallace, when you told me your suspicions, I said he was harmless, said you were exaggerating. I was completely wrong, dangerously wrong. And if you'd listened to me, if you'd given up because of what I said, it wasn't your fault, Linda." Margaret interrupted gently, pulling her friend into the house. He deceived everyone. He was good at that. He had years of practice in appearing normal, in being the polite and respectable neighbor. None of us had any way of knowing. But I should have supported you, Linda insisted, wiping tears from her face. He should have taken his concerns seriously instead of dismissing them. You were being a protective mother, and I made you feel paranoid. Margaret hugged Linda, feeling her friend tremble against her shoulder. Don't blame yourself, please. The important thing is that we now know the truth, and our daughters are safe. In the following days, other mothers in the neighborhood sought out Margaret. First came Jennifer Rodriguez, mother of the 9-year-old twins who appeared in several of the photographs in Wallace's bedroom. She arrived accompanied by Sarah Henderson, whose 7-year-old daughter was also among the victims photographed. Then came Patricia Chen and Maria Santos, both with young daughters that Wallace had been observing and documenting. The 5 women gathered in Margaret's living room on a Thursday afternoon. Emma was at Grandma Dorothy's house again, so they could speak freely. The atmosphere was heavy, loaded with contradictory emotions. Relief that his daughters are safe. Horror to discover that they had been in danger without knowing it. Guilt for not having noticed the signs. Gratitude that Margaret took action. I greeted that man every week, Jennifer Rodriguez said, voice shaking. I let my girls play in the front yard unsupervised. He waved at them sometimes, and I thought it was just a neighbor's kindness. It never crossed my mind that he was doing that. What's worse is that he looked so normal, Sarah Henderson added, wringing her hands nervously in her lap. So harmless, as we should know, as any mother should know. I think that's what scares me the most, Maria Santos said softly, that I didn't know, that I looked at that man dozens of times and never saw anything wrong. It makes me question my own judgment about everything. Margaret looked at the 4 women, seeing her own fear and doubt reflected in their faces. You have not failed your daughters, she said firmly. He was an experienced predator. He knew exactly how to camouflage himself, how to appear harmless. The only reason I found out was because Emma had the courage to tell me she was scared. And even so, I almost didn't believe it. I almost convinced myself that I was exaggerating. We all want to believe that our neighborhoods are safe, that our neighbors are good. This is human. But now we know better. What are you going to do now? Patricia Chen asked. I heard that there are journalists wanting to interview you, that you're being called a hero. Margaret gave a short, bitter laugh. I'm not a heroine. I'm just a mum who did what any mum should do. I protected my daughter. As for journalists, I don't know yet. Part of me wants to forget all that and move on. But another part thinks that maybe it should speak. Maybe my story can help other moms trust their instincts, not ignore when their kids tell them something is wrong. Please speak up, Linda Patterson said with intensity. Please tell your story. Because I know there are other mums out there going through the same thing you went through, having that feeling in my stomach that something isn't right, but fearing to look crazy or overprotective. They need to hear that it's okay to investigate, that it's okay to trust the maternal instinct. The 5 women agreed to unite. They decided to enroll all their daughters in therapy with the same psychologist, so that the girls could eventually have group sessions and process what they had experienced together. They also decided to support each other, to create a surveillance network in the neighborhood, never again to assume that appearances were enough. We failed to notice this time, Jennifer said as they were leaving, but we will never fail again. Now we are attentive. Now we know that monsters don't look like monsters. They look like polite neighbors. The entire neighborhood was in deep shock. Newspaper reports covered the case extensively. The Portland Tribune ran a headline that read, "Heroic Mother Uncovers Criminal Network While Investigating Suspicious Neighbor." The Oregon Daily News wrote, "Maternal Instinct Saves 15 Children from Doomed Predator." Local social media buzzed with discussions about child safety, about warning signs, about how the Wallace case changed the way families viewed their neighborhoods. Reporters knocked on Margaret's door regularly. She turned down most of the interviews for the first few weeks, needing time to process everything, to take care of Emma, to start healing. But she eventually agreed to speak to a local journalist named Rebecca Moore, who had covered child protection cases for years and who Margaret felt would understand the sensitivity of the situation. The interview was careful and respectful. Rebecca didn't ask for unnecessary graphic details. It focused on Margaret's emotional journey, the difficult decisions, the doubts she faced. And when the story was published a week later, Margaret was surprised by the reaction. Hundreds of women got in touch through social networks and email. Mothers across the country sharing their own stories of maternal instinct, of being called paranoid, of eventually finding out that their suspicions were correct. A woman from Texas wrote, "I knew something was wrong with the coach of my daughter's softball team, but when I mentioned it to other mums, they said I was making things up. It took me 6 months to finally install a hidden camera in my daughter's bag. What I recorded was enough to arrest him. Your story makes me feel less alone." Another mum from California shared, "My ex-husband has visitation with our kids. My 6-year-old daughter started saying she didn't want to go to her father's house, but the judge said I was trying to alienate her parents. I insisted on mandatory therapy, and eventually my daughter revealed abuse. I've been fighting in court for 2 years. Stories like yours give me the strength to continue." Margaret read each message with a heavy heart, realizing that her experience was not unique. There were countless mothers fighting silent battles to protect their children, facing disbelief and resistance, being called exaggerated or crazy. She responded to every message she could, offering words of encouragement and validation. But while dealing with outside attention, Margaret's priority remained Emma. The girl had begun therapy with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a child psychologist who specializes in trauma. The first sessions were challenging. Emma had difficulty expressing in words what she had felt during those months of fear. So Dr. Martinez used jokes, drawings, stories. In one session, Emma drew the Harrisons' house and Mr. Wallace's house side by side. She drew herself in the backyard, small and vulnerable. He drew a figure in the window of the house next door, just a dark and menacing silhouette. He drew his mother as a large protective figure between her and that window. "Did you feel protected by your mother?" Dr. Martinez asked gently, looking at the drawing. "Now, yes," Emma answered, "but before I was afraid to tell her. I thought she was going to say that I was making it up, or that he was going to be mad at me for some reason." "Why did you think that, honey?" Margaret asked, her heart sinking to hear that. "Because Mr. Wallace was an adult," Emma explained with the simple logic of a child. "And adults are good. That's what everyone says. So if I thought an adult was being scary, maybe the problem was with me." Margaret felt tears burn her eyes. I had never considered that Emma could be carrying that guilt, that fear of not being believed. "Oh, my love," she said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "The problem was never you. Never. You were brave to tell me. Very brave." The sessions continued weekly. Emma gradually processed the trauma. She understood that she had done nothing wrong, that the fear she felt was valid and important. Dr. Martinez also worked with Margaret, teaching her about warning signs in children that may indicate abuse or fear, teaching about how to create an environment where a child feels safe to share any concern, no matter how small it seems. Margaret learned that she should never say things like, "Don't be silly," or "You're exaggerating," when Emma expresses discomfort. He learned to ask open-ended questions, listening without judgment, validating feelings even when he didn't fully understand the reasons. Months passed. Winter came and went. Spring has arrived with flowers blooming in the neighborhood's gardens. And slowly, gradually, Emma began to return to being the cheerful, confident girl she had always been. He began to play in the yard again, though at first he always looked nervously at the house next door, which was now empty, with a sale sign in front. Margaret installed a taller fence between the two properties, completely blocking the view from one house to the other. Installed additional security cameras. But more important than any physical security measure, he established open and constant communication with Emma. Every night before Emma went to sleep, Margaret would sit on the edge of the bed and they would talk. Not just about the day at school or the plans for the weekend, but about feelings, about fears, about anything that was on Emma's mind. "If something or someone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me," Margaret always asked. "It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter where you are. You can always tell me and I will always believe you." "Yes, Mom," Emma answered, "always." And Margaret saw in her daughter's eyes that she really believed it now. That the trust between them had been not only restored, but strengthened. That Emma knew with absolute certainty that her mother was her guardian, her protector, someone who would always put her safety above all else. Richard Wallace stood trial 8 months after his arrest. Margaret had to testify, reliving that terrible day when she entered his house, describing what she found, explaining the decisions she made. It was painful, but necessary. And when the judge read the sentence, 25 years in prison, without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years, Margaret felt an immense weight being lifted from her shoulders. The other families whose daughters had been photographed were present in the courtroom that day. When the sentence was read, several women cried with relief. The prosecutor, an experienced man named David Chen, approached Margaret afterward and shook her hand firmly. Without his courage, he said, this man would still be free. He would still be watching children. He would still be planning. You didn't just save your daughter, Mrs. Harrison. He saved countless other children who would have been his victims in the future. Margaret just nodded, not trusting his voice to answer without breaking. She didn't feel heroic. She was simply grateful. Grateful for having trusted instinct. Grateful for having acted. Thankful that Emma was safe. Before we continue, help bring real stories to those who really care. If you want to be part of this mission, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Margaret Harrison hugged Emma that autumn night, 6 months after the trial, a full year since the day that changed their lives forever. They were snuggled up on the living room couch, the curtains open for the first time in a long time without any fear, watching an animated movie about brave princesses saving their own kingdoms. Emma laughed at the film's jokes, completely relaxed, completely assured, eating popcorn and occasionally offering a handful to her mother. Margaret watched her daughter more than the television screen. He could see the genuine smile on Emma's face. I watched how she moved without that tension that she used to carry on her shoulders. I was watching a girl who had gone through something terrible, but who was healing, was growing stronger, was learning that surviving something difficult does not define you. It strengthens you. "Mummy," Emma said suddenly, turning to look at Margaret with those bright blue eyes, "do you think that when I grow up, I can help other children? How Dr. Martinez helps us?" Margaret felt her heart tighten with love and pride. "I think you can do anything you want, my love. And I think you're already helping other kids just by being brave, just sharing your story when you feel comfortable." And it was true. Margaret had created a small non-profit called Voices That Matter, dedicated to teaching children about personal safety and teaching parents about warning signs and effective communication. Emma, when she felt ready, would attend a few events, telling her story in an age-appropriate way, telling other children that it was okay to speak up when something seemed wrong, that trusted adults would always believe them. Margaret and Emma's story spread beyond Portland. She was invited to speak in schools, at child safety conferences, in parents' groups, always with the same central message: trust your maternal instinct. Believe your children when they tell you something is wrong. Don't be afraid to investigate. to ask tough questions, to appear overprotective, because at the end of the day, there is no such thing as overprotection when it comes to children. There is only protection. And Margaret always ended her lectures by saying, "I'd rather be called paranoid and be wrong than be called confident and be right about danger. I'd rather investigate 1,000 times and find that there was nothing than to let go once and find out too late that there was something." The legacy of that decision to enter the neighbor's house that Monday morning continued to expand. The arrest of Richard Wallace led to the dismantling of a larger network. 16 people were arrested in 4 different states. Hundreds of children were identified through the seized files, and their families were discreetly notified. Therapy and support were offered, lives were saved and protected, and it all started because an 8-year-old girl had the courage to say, "Mommy, I'm afraid." And because a mother had the courage to believe. The house next door was finally sold. A young family has moved in, a couple with a newborn baby. Margaret greeted them with a welcome cake and a warm smile, as any neighbor would, but also with vigilance. Because she had learned that being friendly doesn't mean being naive. That community requires both warmth and attention. Emma returned to play in the yard every day when the weather permitted. He built sandcastles, chased butterflies, hung from the blue swing, laughing out loud, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window as she prepared dinner, her heart full of gratitude for every normal, safe day, for every laugh, for every moment of carefree joy Emma deserved to have. This was not just the story of a danger averted. It was the story about the power of maternal instinct, about the importance of listening to children, about how the courage to act can change everything. It was about how evil can lurk in the most unlikely places, behind the white picket fences and manicured gardens of suburban neighborhoods. But it was also about how good always wins when courage meets action, when love meets determination, when a mother decides that nothing, absolutely nothing, will be more important than protecting her daughter. Margaret knew with every fiber of her being that she would do it all over again. I would enter that house 1,000 times. I would face that man 1,000 times. I would risk everything 1,000 times, because there is nothing in the world more valuable than the safety and well-being of a child. And all mothers should know this. They should carry this in their hearts as a shield. They should be ready to act when necessary. She thought of all the mothers who were probably going through something similar at that very moment. Mothers having that uncomfortable feeling in their stomachs, that instinct telling them something isn't right. Mothers being called paranoid, overprotective, exaggerated. And she wanted them all to know, you're not crazy. Your instinct exists for a reason. Millions of years of evolution have put this alarm system inside you. When it fires, listen. Always listen. Because in the end, mothers are not just caregivers. They are guardians. They are warriors when they need to be. And when a child needs protection, when a child is in danger, there is no force in the world that can stop a mother determined to protect. Margaret Harrison learned this. Emma Harrison learned this. And now, through their story, thousands of other people were learning as well. Don't go out. Take the next step in this journey by watching the next video on our channel, which will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to discover stories that touch the heart and teach us about courage, love, and protection. A big hug and see you in the next exciting story.